Hello there from India. Good evening. This is Abhivardhan from Internationalism Global Podcasts, and we begin with the season 2 of Global Hint. In the last season, we started from July. We had amazing discussions. We ranged from the Indo Pacific to Russia to even the United States. And this time, we would like to begin with a new perspective of the global affairs. And so I have actually invited Alex with us. I would be more than happy to introduce Alex. So basically, Alex he's a writer, he's a researcher, he's based in Sao Paulo, and he's also the host of the Of a Bunga Bunga podcast, which is available on Twitter. He's also the co-author of a very interesting book, which I believe people might be interested to read since they might be interested in politics, which is known as The End of History. Now, we know the End of History by Francis Fukuyama, but this is something which is different. So I believe people must have a look at it. They must go to Amazon. It's available, maybe from 25th June, if I'm correct. He's also in consultancy and other affairs. And when it comes to academic background, basically Alex is from King's College London and the University of Kent. So Alex, welcome to the podcast, and I'm more than happy to have you on board.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's begin the discussion. So in this episode, we are going to discuss the Brazilianization of the world, or what we would call the Brazilianization of the global order. So for a sense of perspective, if you can give us a brief insight about what is actually Brazilianization as a concept, and what inspired you to actually write an article on that, which you published recently in the American Affairs Journal, if I'm right. So if you can give us a context in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, then maybe we can deep dive in.
Sure. So, I think the idea started, I've been sort of thinking about it, discussing on my own podcast for a while, the seeming impression that the politics of the most advanced societies in the world, if you think of US, Britain, France, whatever, increasingly seem disordered and increasingly like the politics that we're maybe more familiar with in countries of the global south, and especially kind of maybe larger important countries, maybe India, for example, certainly Brazil, maybe South Africa, but which are features like maybe growing corruption or politics, which is seemingly less ideological than it was in the past, but at the same time increasingly messy, and that's one kind of starting point. The other aspect is the social aspect, which is growing inequality. I do think the two things are very closely related, but to treat them separately, you have growing inequality, growing oligarchy, which again also looks like the sort of politics of the most unequal societies in the world. Maybe various Latin American societies, in principle Brazil, but not only, South Africa again, and so on. So that's where it kind of starts from. But why Brazil, right? Because you could just say, well, this is something like the global north becoming like the global south, or the de-development, maybe, if you wish, of the most developed societies in the world. Brazil specifically, because Brazil is a country which was always modern. It was born modern. It didn't have a kind of any significant, really pre-modern civilization before colonialism. So it was always linked into the global economy. In that sense, it was always modern. And it also, through the course of its history, had a real belief in modernization, at the same time as not really ever being able to become fully modern enough. So it was modern. It is in a very urban society already, industrialized, and actually, in fact, deindustrialized, prematurely deindustrialized. So in that sense, it's sort of an ambiguous formation which looks really modern, at the same time as seeming backwards. And what we discover is that those backward elements are not things merely from the past, which have not been fully developed or become fully modern or been overthrown, but are actually things which are in some ways a product of Brazil's course of development, product of its modernization. So this fact of being modern enough is something I think which is very particularly Brazilian. You can maybe find other aspects elsewhere, but I think Brazil encapsulates that history very well. And what you see now is across the world, but especially in the kind of the richest societies, them becoming modern but not modern enough, but in reverse. So they achieved this modernity, and now we somehow see its undoing. And I guess we can explore various aspects of that as we go along.
Well, that's interesting. So, of course, one thing is that even for certain global south countries, it is said that they had to go through, a kind of a process of industrialization. And then there are some countries, unfortunately even India is one of them, that could not go with a proper industrialization. And we all just tapped into the information age, and now there's a problem of what's next. So interestingly, I have a particular question about the perspective that you gave on the end of history, and I found it quite interesting. So if you can give some insight on that, I am sure it might be related to your recent book also, but anyways, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess if we're thinking about different timelines, maybe the Brazilianization thesis is something that happens maybe since as of the 1970s onwards. The end of history is something that pertains to the period after the end of the Cold War. So the original end of history thesis, which you mentioned already in your introduction, in reference to Francis Fukuyama, is this idea that there is sort of the end of ideology, the end of any real alternative to capitalism, and the idea that specifically the form of liberal democracy is the only game in town, right? And that will gradually spread across the world. You might have small variations here and there. You will still have events, things will still happen, but there's no longer any systemic alternative. And certainly in the most developed societies in the West, that whole period from 1991 until, let's say, 2016, or certainly until the global financial crisis of 2008, felt really deadening. Nothing really happened. It never felt that anything could really change. You had maybe left-wing kind of protests and things. You had the anti-globalization movement, but nothing that ever really seemed like a credible alternative. And the establishment was basically unchallenged, and society became gradually more depoliticized, right? So important issues of distribution of wealth, of how to run society, even the notion of a good society seemed to disappear. It was merely about making politics adaptable to change. And so that meant that basically globalization is something that has happened. It's almost a natural force, and politics has to just make little adaptations to it. You need to be open to the global market to attract investment. So there's no sense anymore of taking charge of society by political means and seeking to carry out some form of social transformation, whether that be socialism or development or a more nationalist vision, whatever. That was, we had to kind of forget all these old dreams. What happens then? You have the global financial crisis, and you have its long-term political consequences, or let's say medium-term, maybe. It's not so long ago. But by 2016, what you have is two massive events at the very kind of nerve centers of global capitalism in the UK, especially. And if you think of London as a global financial center, that's very important, and even more so in the United States. And you have the election of Trump in the United States on a sort of anti-globalization platform, albeit from the right rather than from the left. And you have Brexit in the UK, which, Britain seeking to withdraw itself from what is effectively a neoliberal bloc, a kind of pro-market bloc in Europe, which is in itself, maybe you could read it as a form of anti-globalization or deglobalization. And more importantly, maybe than even just the economics of it, is the political aspect to it, which is it's a break with a form of what we call on the podcast and in the book post-politics. But maybe to put it in simpler terms, is just the notion that society is depoliticized, right? That you have a form of management which is driven from above, which seeks to remove important issues from political contestation. Suddenly you have this thing interrupting it, and you have politics seeming to come back. Things become much more chaotic, turbulent, but that's the natural state of politics. And what we had over the course of after the end of the Cold War is a period in which there really wasn't any politics. So just to kind of sum up, why the end of history and not the emergence of something new? The reason for that is that there hasn't been the emergence of something new. What you've had is the collapse of that order that ruled over the West, but from 1989 until 2016. You can set different dates to it. Maybe you want to set 2008 global financial crisis. You can look at kind of rising the euro crisis in over 2012, 13. We like to choose 2016, and certainly by 2020 with the COVID pandemic and the massive states of emergency around the world, huge increases in public spending to fight the crisis. That marks the end of history period, and not necessarily the emergence of something new, but the sort of definitive kind of collapse of that old order without the emergence of anything new. That's why we have this sort of unwieldy double negative, the end of something. But it's not the beginning of history or not the restarting of history, but that old form in which there was no politics and everything was kind of, kept a lid on it, is now gone. The lid's taken off, and lots of weird, crazy things are happening.
That's interesting. So I have a follow up on this. So there are international organizations as well as countries, right? They create their own soft power and hard power empires on their own. And we see it in the United Nations, we see it in the European Coal and Steel Community, which is now the EU. We see it in the United States led NATO. We see it even the Russians now. Even the Chinese are thinking of a vision. Now, you very rightly stated with that, the end of history is a double negative emphasis. And to some extent, yes, that phenomena is very much, being seen, because everywhere a generalization of political phenomena, or what I would like to say is that political consensus and political motivation has happened everywhere. People believe that there is a binary, or there's a particular generalization of systems. So the question which I have is in this regard. Now there are countries and there are alliances which are emerging, maybe some entities or something like that. You have this Quad of the Indo-Pacific, or you have other Indo-Pacific alliances, or you have other strategic partnerships which Russia is trying to have, or maybe some Eastern European countries are trying. So in that sense, of course, this is not something significant, as it is very perpetual and it may take a lot of time. Do we think that the idea of civilizational state will matter? And why am I asking this is because the civilizational state as a concept has been used to actually create the liberal order at the first place. The very idea of the Council of Europe, the idea of United Nations, European Court of Human Rights. And I generally work on how political motivation and political consensus exist in countries, in the sense, like, of course, at least in the Indo-Pacific, I understand it. So do we see that the usual notions which have actually been coming in are crumbling in terms of one aspect of civilization state which the UN and the West try to create? So what do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, so if I've understood the concept correctly, I think the notion of certainly of the West as the bearer of liberalism and democracy, and indeed of liberal democracy, was something that it instrumentalized during the Cold War, because it had this opposition to the Soviet Union and to really existing socialist regimes, to China as well. And that, however maybe phony that was, in the sense that those ideals weren't always lived up to, there was a certain pressure for them to still deliver, right? To deliver increases in material affluence, increases in freedom, even if it was just in the limited sense of increased consumption or freedom to go out and buy what you want to buy. That was still something that they felt obliged to deliver on. What happens is that once you have the defeat, not just, and then the crumbling of the USSR and the really existing socialist regimes, and not just that, but also the defeat of the organized working class within the West, within Western countries, is that elites no longer are really held to account, and they don't really have anything threatening them and disciplining them to make sure that they actually do deliver. And so you have this erosion, even within those states, of those civilizational promises of democracy, of freedom, and so on. Democracy becomes increasingly withered within Western states. And so what you have, kind of at the level of international relations, is no longer a conflict between what are ostensibly two systemic difference, or kind of two different systemic blocks presenting a different vision of what society looks like. So even today, when you talk about, there's lots of talk about kind of new Cold War, right, between the West or between the US and China, which I think is a nonsense, because the Cold War had some sense of there being a different model of society. Maybe, the Soviet Union, especially by its later period, was not so appealing anymore, but nevertheless, it had a different, at least the aspiration to achieve communism. It never got there, but it had this aspiration of it. China doesn't present really any systemic alternative. In fact, it certainly doesn't have any aspirations to conquer the world and change it in its own image. Its interests are more mercantilistic, or interested maybe just in its own kind of expansion of its own power, and also the interest of the Chinese Communist Party in retaining control domestically, but it doesn't really have a vision for an alternative vision for the world. So in that sense, you don't have the same effect on the West that the Cold War did, because you don't have this challenge from an alternative. What you are maybe seeing is some sense that the West, and you can maybe see it with Biden's spending plans in the US, of trying to respond to the fact that you have deteriorating infrastructure, growing regional inequalities, growing income inequality, because China sort of represents some sort of challenge, and this need to we need to confront China. But I think that's relatively meager. The measures are meager, and the motivations that provides are relatively meager as well. So you don't have, it's not a new Cold War. I mean, it's just geopolitical conflict as you've had in periods before the 20th century. Or indeed, even in the early 20th century, if you think of the period leading up to the First World War, it's sort of inter-imperial conflict, but without any sort of ideological element to it.
Yeah, of course, because I believe that we don't see ideological worldviews imposing so much. Like the Cold War era was just very gross about how from way of life to everything, ideology was at the center point, whether in America or whether in the Soviet blocs. We don't see that with China also, because even China's socialism model, whatever it is, because it is state-run capitalism also to some extent. They even have their own gongos in Africa and other regions. So, of course, you're right. I mean, they are much about mercantilistic concerns. And in fact, even if we see in history, why did China make the Wall of China or the Silk Route at the first place? They did it for their own purposes to avoid particular interference. So, of course, that is definitely there that, China does not have a global vision in that sense. Or if we say there is an alternative per se from China, we don't see that very directly. So, in that regard, do you think that there are certain quote unquote good countries or reliable countries who have some miniature visions? Like there are certain countries who actually are trying to work in aspects of development and governance. They are actually trying to innovate, although they are not perfect and nobody is perfect. So if you believe, if you can give, maybe if there are or if there are not, if you can give some insight on that.
No. Basically, no. Though I'm interested to hear from you, Abi Vardhan, about what countries you do think maybe present some sort of model or are innovating in some way, because I personally don't see it. So I'm curious, if you have something particular in mind.
Sure. Well, I believe there are a few global South countries and maybe a few in global North which try to diversify and try to create their own unique positions. Now, of course, a few of them I believe are in the Indo-Pacific, as people say in rhetoric, in the Asian region. One of them, of course, I will say India, but not that much, because again, India has its own problems, but still it has. Again, we are saying that they're not perfect. Then I believe then another country could be Singapore, which is in the Indo-China region. Another which we could add is maybe in the Middle East, where are three countries which I believe might have, because they are getting technologically advanced and trying to do, which is Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. But again, they have also their own messed up problems. Then again, maybe in Europe, I'm not sure much about it, because again, that's not my area. But these countries I currently believe might have, but again, they are not something which is like, okay, fine, we are institutionalized, we are doing it very perfectly. But yeah, we're just trying to balance some things out. But again, I'm not saying them to do it. That's why I actually was thinking to ask you. But since you asked me, I'm telling you, these countries I believe. But again, you may disagree with that. I have no issues with it.
No, I think they're interesting examples, because I don't think they necessarily demonstrate any ability to provide a model for other countries. I mean, Singapore, which a lot of kind of libertarians or neoliberals in the West, not just in the West, but I mean, in Brazil, for example, like to point out as a model, like, oh, if we just, had more free trade, liberalized, we're more open to foreign capital, then we could develop and become like Singapore. The truth is that Singapore is unique and is not at all a model. I mean, it wouldn't managed to actually catch up development, often had a very strong role for the state in leading development and imposed capital controls and various other measures, right? Nationalized industries, state development banks, and all these kinds of things. Singapore, firstly, in the first place, did actually use a lot of state-led means to get to where it is now, and secondly, in its kind of political economic practice today, it's a small city-state which is able to leverage its position as a global financial hub, and not everyone can or even would want to be necessarily a global financial hub, because it's precisely a recycling of capital produced elsewhere rather than actually producing new value. And that's kind of a problem of the world today, that there isn't very many places actually producing a lot of new value. I mean, maybe China is an exception. And so I think if you look, and Saudi Arabia can't present a model because not everybody has oil. And if everybody was an oil producer, the price would drop and you wouldn't be able to become a Saudi Arabia. So I think the examples you give are interesting precisely, I think, because they are examples of particularisms which are not exportable. Like you can't say, hey, let's have Argentina be the new Saudi Arabia, or whatever, South Africa be the new Singapore.
Agreed. And that's the thing about it. I think what is actually happening is that there are particularisms. There are countries which are developing in their own models. In fact, I think in many Asian countries like Singapore and even China actually employed a lot of state capitalism and state-led machineries, and they do it a lot. I mean, it's a misconceived notion that neoliberalism works so well in Asia. It's not true. Neoliberalism is there, but limitedly. There's some amount of capitalism from private actors, but without state capacity, it does not work out. I think it stems even in Vietnam. Even in India, it used to be, but in India, again, it's a funny case. I can tell it some other day, because in India, the problem is that our state capitalism never focused on efficiency in that sense. So what is happening is that in India, one particular is the conservative part of it, which is saying, oh, no, let's just have the old system and let it be, which is not going to be sustainable. Neither is going to help India's position. But a second portion is more getting like a Thatcher. So they want that, okay, fine, let's privatize, let's be like Donald Reagan and all that. But practically it doesn't work out. So why it will not work out? Because of the big population. And the another problem with India is that you don't have enough, you have a lot of vacancies. You start from income tax to foreign affairs to anything. You have a lot of vacancies. So, big demography, big country, you have a permanent mission in New York. And how many members do you have? Nearly 20 to 30 or something like that. Then how can you compete China or any other country in that sense? So, of course, but I think, so particularism at least gives us this insight that, the vision of a global order is fine, but it's not perfect. And it will, I think, maybe take time for countries to come out of the whole thing, because at the end of the day, it's not a perfect thing and it takes time. So let's discuss about modernity without development. Now, why do I wish to discuss it? Now, of course, when you discuss about Brazilianization, I completely get the whole model as to how developmental trajectories happen, how social inequalities actually widen. And I think that we see in neoliberal economies a lot. Some instances of and some figments of that we see in India also, because of course due to COVID much has been affected, and even in other countries in that sense, where neoliberalism has been implemented at its own seesaw manner. So when we talk about modernity without development, from a more aesthetic and social point of view, how do you see it? From an economic point of view, we understand, we have been discussing it. So from an aesthetic and social point of view, like creativity and how are you innovating things, what do you think of it?
Well, I guess the nub of it, or the nucleus of that idea, is that you have in modern countries, right, which are urbanized, you have people who are no longer attached to the land in the way that they once were. Society economies which are no longer primarily agrarian, they're industrial, or indeed post-industrial, with large service sectors. That all sounds good, but where does the without development bit come in? And there, it's a question of the fact that manufacturing no longer is able to, because of advances in productivity, is no longer able to absorb that much labor. So you have, Brazil's a great example of premature deindustrialization, but it's something that's happened in many places across the world. There's also, even in China, the workshop of the world, there's a famous case that over the course of its exceptional increase in output over 15 years, the absolute number of workers employed in industry in manufacturing specifically has remained constant. So despite this massive increase in output, the productivity gains made it so that you basically still have the same number of people working in factories. So the old means by which the first or second wave of developing countries were able to, or even maybe the third wave, but were able to incorporate the masses into labor, into like manufacturing employment, which allowed them to form unions, or they had to fight to form unions to gain concessions from employers, from the state. Sometimes it led to kind of more corporatist arrangements where the state was kind of in charge, but which at least guaranteed workers a more stable form of employment. They could have houses, maybe even come to own their own houses in the richest countries. So the society that creates, the image that we have of the most developed societies in the world, if you think of the United States in the late 1970s or whatever you want to take it as, that's an image which is no longer there, or to the extent that it's there, it's kind of falling apart, because what you have is increasing service sector employment, which is famously low productivity. So you have low growth. Economy is increasingly financialized, and the reality that employment is increasingly precarious. So you don't have any longer the sort of stable formal employment that you could plan for the future with, right? So you can say, okay, maybe I'm not able to buy a house now, but if I work, I'll be able to save up, and there's an expanding economy where there's lots of house building going on, and I'll be able to own my own home and have a family, blah blah blah. That whole form of society has kind of fallen apart. And so why do I use Brazil as the example of that? And I use Brazil as the example of that because Brazil is at the vanguard of the crisis of modernity. And so this crisis of, I put, modernity without development, but I mean, the basic idea is that, yes, you have a modern society, but which is not able to become modern enough. It's not able to complete that social transformation, which I've just been describing, that happened, especially after the Second World War in the most developed countries. That's no longer able to happen. And that's the case because Brazil started deindustrializing earlier and had this mass increase in informal employment, something which I'm sure you're familiar with in India as well. And that degree of informality is something which is not just happening in Brazil or in India, but which is increasingly kind of at the vanguard of employment in the United States and Britain and so on. So if you think of like the Uberization of work, that's something that's happening everywhere, right? And so that you don't have the same, you asked me about the kind of, I don't know, aesthetic or political sort of, or aesthetic or social kind of vision of that. And it's a society in which people have to scramble around for work, often working several jobs at once, without the ability to really plan for the future, because you don't have guaranteed employment. You don't know if there's going to be people, calling you to drive your taxi that day, to drive your Uber. You don't know, and that's not going to, if you fall ill, you're not going to have any rights which will guarantee you, wages even when you're not able to work, and so on. So that whole, that crumbling of that old structure of work is what's at the key, the center of that, and something which, you can imagine all the kind of social consequences of that.
So, one example from the social component of it, since we discussed employment, and I very well agree that the one thing which is happening even apparently is that the services sector is increasing. I think there's one idea which was discussed by an investor known as Balaji Srinivasan. He's from, I think, California or maybe some other state. He discussed that there's something called as nomad countries. Now, what happens in a nomad country? Somebody is living in a particular area, like an island or something, and that guy goes to a European, Western, or any other developed country, and then the person stays for a while. He does some traveling. He does his traveling, but he's like a travel agent or something like that, some online work, and somehow those kind of people. Okay, good questions are coming. I'll take them, and they're actually trying to create their own structures, distributed structures, and they come back to the same place, and at the same time they're traveling, they're vlogging also, and they're trying to create their own community. That's something which is known as a nomadic country. And trust me, I think it doesn't happen in the manufacturing sector. You can't do that. You need to stay there where you are or something like that. Or maybe in manufacturing you need those kind of agreements among countries and companies, which I don't think so it's going to happen so soon. So in that sense, I think nomad countries are very interesting. So there are two questions by same person, so we'll take one question at a time. So this question is by Halim Dina. I'm just showing on the screen. It is like this: would you say it might be possible to consciously un-Brazilify a society or a country? So what do you think of it?
Yes, through revolution. I mean, to be blunt about it, because I mean, it's something that I describe in my essay is precisely the fact that Brazil didn't have to become the Brazil that we know, right? That it had moments, opportunities to become much more developed. And so there's some key moments. So I mentioned this in the essay. If you look at there was a right-wing coup in 1964 supported by the United States but led by national elites who felt that the working class was gaining more power, that you have growing industry, you had very, very high growth rates over a long period of time, especially from the kind of early 20th century all the way up to the 1960s, 1970s. And that was leading to the growth of cities, the growth of the manufacturing, like industrial working class, and they were gaining more power. They were becoming more threatening, and they could have been bought off. They could have been more incorporated into society, but instead they decided to mount this coup, which would then be much more hostile to trade unions, and which would increasingly make Brazil more dependent on kind of the external powers. And so even there, whether that would lead to a kind of socialist revolution or whether that would lead to some kind of growth of a indigenous social democracy in Brazil, I don't know. But the point being is that you obviously have a kind of social catastrophe that emerges from that failed opportunity and the connivance of national elites with global capital to effectively crush the aspirations of the Brazilian masses. So could one de-Brazilify a country today or halt this tendency? I think let me rather than just speaking kind of abstractly, because otherwise that's just going to be my opinion and maybe that's not so interesting. What you've had is since the global financial crisis, which has severely struck at the kind of the ruling order in Western countries, and not just there, because it's destabilized matters, everywhere. You've had kind of various populist upsurges, and they've been on the left, but mainly on the right. And even though those which haven't succeeded in really changing anything, because I don't believe, especially the right-wing populists, had no real aspirations to change things. In the end, what ends up happening is just slight shifts on, for example, becoming more hostile to immigration or various kind of social conservative measures. But the reality of the country's political economy doesn't change. You still remain with neoliberalism, neoliberalism with more authoritarian features, effectively. But nevertheless, those threats to the kind of existing liberal elite have driven them to undertake measures which we're now seeing, perhaps with pandemic fighting measures, with kind of massive increases in state spending, because there's some sense of need to resolve some of the regional inequalities, and develop infrastructure more. And you see this in the US right now. Is that enough? No, by no means is it enough. And if you look at Biden's plans, they're completely meager in relation to what is actually necessary. They sound like really big numbers. You're talking about trillions of dollars, and that sounds like a lot, but spaced over 8 years or whatever, it amounts to very little. But at least there, it's signaling a bit of a shift. It's signaling a bit of a shift away from the neoliberalism we knew, maybe even beyond neoliberalism. But at the same time, what's happening is that you don't really have any challenge to employment relations, to labor relations. Those processes of precaritization, casualization of labor, outsourcing, and so on, continue despite maybe some changes at the sort of at the top political level. So at the social level, of employment relations, that continues. And if that doesn't change, then you don't have any halting of the Brazilification, I guess, of that I speak of. So the reality is that it needs workers to fight for their rights and to speak to actually challenge employers to either hold on to rights which are trying to be withered away, or to gain ones that have been completely lost. So the arrangements which allow employers to provide any employment, any rights to employees, which allow them to have employment at will and them to be fired at will. Those sorts of things need to be challenged. And the way that you have that is, effectively would be the creation of unions or other organizations which could bring together, the so-called precariat, to fight for rights and to fight for higher wages and so on. And that's the nucleus of it, and that's the only place where you can start, I think.
Quite interesting. Okay, there are too many questions. So let's see. Either what I can do is that I can go with the follow-ups, and meanwhile I can take the questions, and then we can proceed so that the discussion goes on and we just do not give too much time into just questions. So of course we'll take the questions. So okay, let's take one more and then I'll go with the follow-ups and the other part of the discussion. So I think it's just the same person who's asking, but the question is this: what countries do you think might be the last to become like this, which is Brazilianized? So what do you think?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose the countries which are able to best insulate themselves from these sorts of dislocations, but even there's still this similar sort of processes. So, you might think Norway, oil rich, very wealthy, has highly unionized workforces. I mean, across the Scandinavian countries, that remains the case. So you can have a break on inequality, on deteriorating social services. You still have a kind of notion of consensus politics, which I'm not advocating for. I don't think consensus politics is good because real politics is conflictual, but they have some notion of consensus which stops the kind of deterioration that you've seen elsewhere. So there's a need to hold to a kind of social model. Does that mean that it'll not be Brazilianized? No, but it just will kind of retard the process. And then you have other countries maybe which are following a kind of different trajectory, where you have China perhaps as an example, where you have this huge growth rates which are able to transform society. And growth, it doesn't lead to a predetermined point. It kind of that dynamism shakes up society and uproots people from one place to another, transforms cities and so on. And so that can create new political ventures. People can try out new things. People can come together. New masses can be brought together into different configurations. The point being is that the future is open, when you have growth. And when you don't have growth, and where societies become increasingly sclerotic, and you can think of probably Italy as a great example, which basically hasn't grown in 30 years, is where politics becomes not necessarily more predictable, because you can have a lot of kind of chaos, but it's one where things aren't shaken up, and society becomes increasingly defensive against changes. And not in a positive way. So it becomes increasingly defensive against immigration, because immigrants are seen as a threat, because you don't have a growing economy which is able to integrate people and provide jobs and so on. So I don't know where I was going with this, other than to say, perhaps China provides something which doesn't really fit the analysis that I was that I'm arguing for. There's another thing I should add, is that the economic historian Adam Tooze wrote an interesting piece in response to my piece, pointing out quite correctly that many countries would be lucky to become like Brazil, because many states are poor and weak. And he was talking specifically about the Caribbean and Central America, and those are very good examples. Brazil, despite everything that I describe, and I don't paint a very pretty picture of Brazil and the tendencies that it exemplifies, nevertheless is still a relatively strong state, with a lot of kind of domestic capital, with the capacities to do something good with it. It isn't using those capacities, and the current Bolsonaro government is doing its best to destroy state capacity along with Brazilian democracy. But there is still certain potential there. Maybe not to carry out catch-up development any longer, but at least to provide somewhat of a more civilized state and protect itself from certain global dynamics, and indeed even from natural consequences, natural disasters and so on. Whereas if you're a small Caribbean island, and you're getting hit by hurricanes every year, you maybe just simply don't have the state capacity to deal with that. So to present and vision than the one that I present in the article, you can look at a poor Caribbean state where you're even worse off.
So I would like to go up with a follow-up, and this follow-up is more about culture. And this question, which I've got from the audience, again, I think it's the same person, is very much related to what I wish to ask. So I'm presenting that question also, and I'm going to give a context from my side also. This question I found very interesting because I've been kind of trying to understand cultural policy for some time. The question is very simple, which is, do you have any comments on cultural Americanization and some parallels? So one thing which happens is that even in India, it's a problem that due to colonialism and many other issues, even economics issues, your cultural and artistic systems actually degrade. That is very obvious. That happens in any society. And if you have poverty for a long time, of course your cultural systems and artistic system and even your assets of entertainment will be affected, whether it's anything. But since the 1990s, when we went for a liberalization under Narasimha Rao, we basically adopted the American aspect of entertainment and culture very much. We took a lot of American films. We have great ties with the American diaspora, whether Indian diaspora or whatever. We still have it, but again, it's a conflicting position, because what's happening is that the idea that America thinks that everyone should be subjected to regime change should not happen. So what is happening is that people in India are saying, no, we want to be reserved. Let us be what we are. But they're not even, of course, getting to the the non-aligned movement position of the Cold War. But they're just saying that the America just should keep up to themselves and try to manage their own problems first. So I see this trend of Americanization, but apart from Americanization, I believe it's more kind of happening mostly in the Anglophone countries. I am not sure about the non-English speaking countries, but I believe that it's happening more in the English culture, or the more countries which are more adapted to Indian culture, in English culture and in English language. It's happening in more those countries. Like Japan is also there, India, of course. I would add Australia and all those Anglophone parts. United States and Canada, of course, are in the list, and so the UK and Ireland. So what do you think on that? I would say it's kind of an Anglicization plus Americanization. So what do you think? Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. Thanks for that question. It's something that interests me quite a bit. And obviously, I think cultural interchange is a good thing, right? But the form of Americanization specifically that we're seeing is quite problematic. And the way Americanization was understood in, let's say 1960s, 70s, all the way to maybe until the 1990s, was about the generalization, firstly, of American standards of living, which can be a good thing, like have bigger cars or being able to, wearing jeans and drinking Coca-Cola. I don't care about that one way or the other. And in many ways, it can be just an index of rising standards of living. Good thing, right? But what you have more recently is a specific form of Americanization, which is transmitted through the internet, which has kind of caught me by surprise. And I think in the past decade, it's very striking what's happened. And so I wrote about this last year in reference to something specific, but I think the lessons of it are apply more broadly, which is where you had the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. And whatever you think about those, and I think there's some good and some bad aspects to it, but they became kind of globalized. And so you saw kind of Black Lives Matter protests in other societies. But the problem is that those protesters were using the same exact discourse as was being used in the US, but in societies which are radically different. So, the US has a underprivileged and historically oppressed Black minority, but a substantial enough minority, right, which is a product of slavery and so on. How does that make any sense in countries without that history? How does that make sense in Germany or in Poland or in New Zealand? They're just very different countries. And so what you have is a form of, I guess, global homogenization, which is not just the importation of the American way of doing things as it was, in the period from the 1950s on to the 1990s, jeans and Coca-Cola. But it's specifically a form of flattening history. So to put it in maybe more academic and highfalutin terms, what you have is a kind of American-led postmodernization of society, right? So you have and postmodernization in some ways is better spoken of as a detachment from your own national history and your own trajectory of development that you have in mind. What happens is that this Americanization transmitted through the internet leads to discourses, to kind of culture wars, to even kind of politics in different countries, which completely flatten their own experience and reduce it to a kind of American form of culture war. So you have this sort of identity politics, to take probably the most obvious example, where American style identity politics, which emerged in universities in the United States, especially in the 1980s, then become transmitted to other countries. And instead of allowing those countries to deal with their own national issues and come up with creative solutions to those, to find their own way to becoming more modern or to developing a better future for themselves, it gets wrapped into this web of ideas which don't have any connection to the national situation. And so you're discussing things in terms which aren't yours, it's not your own language which you've come up with to describe your own issues, your own in linking with your own history, with that trajectory, and saying, okay, we were previously maybe colonized and now we have problems of deindustrialization. We have such and such, and we have a tradition of orientation towards such and such a country, or the development of our own national literature, which we think is important. No, it becomes completely kind of erased and homogenized and flattened. And so, however critical I am of the development of culture wars in the United States, which I think are very problematic for impeding the development of politics, of real politics, because it just polarizes things on kind of cultural lines which don't really apply to most people and don't deal fundamentally with material issues. And that's the biggest problem of it. However bad that is in the United States, it's far worse when that same thing becomes applied to other societies which have no real connection to those issues. And so, yes, there is a kind of Americanization which is being pursued through the internet, which is really damaging. And I would like to, I've made this joke elsewhere before, but if you take MAGA, right, the Donald Trump slogan, "Make America Great Again," I'd like to, adapt that to "Make America Go Away." Nothing against the United States, but they should stick to their own issues, and, other societies have their own issues to deal with. And it's only through serious reflection and also conflict over what you want your own society to be in those own societies that you're able to kind of come to your own solutions for things, being creative about it, and rather than importing solutions which have no reference in other societies.
Well, I really like the reference of MAGA here. So this MAGA is actually better than the last MAGA. Anyways, I think we even see this in India also. Like, I can give you one instance. So you know that the English game cricket is very popular in our country, right? And I think even some South American countries also are involved in cricket, if I'm right.
I don't know. I've never heard of any cricket here, but no.
No. Okay, no issues. I thought that
rugby has, if you're talking about traditionally British sports, but cricket.
No cricket. Okay. So with us is that there was one cricketer, and on Twitter he posted something. All he did was, it was just like a BLM hashtag. He just changed the black word and put it with some Indian word. And he just posted it on social media, showing a particular symbol, which was very identical to how the BLM people do. Now, of course, there are justified discourses from their side in America, and this is their problem completely. But again, so I can give one simple example. Now, we very well know that affirmative action has not been successful very well in America. Right, because with Asian Americans and others, it has always been a mess. But in India, we had a form of an affirmative action, which we had since the independence time, which is the reservation system under Article 15. And to be very promising, it has helped a lot of oppressed communities in that sense. But I think, as you're saying, that we are discussing issues which are not even our own, which are actually of the other places. It happened the same with us. And interestingly, that was one of the reasons why I wish to discuss, is that what I also have generally seen is that discourses are not worth it related to even Indian affairs or Indian realities. And sometimes, as the middle class is actually trying to grow in India, which is actually got into the political elite now, is trying to get into actually in the current central government, which is union government and so forth. The concern that people have is that how far will this Americanization go? So, of course, the next part which we will be discussing will be more focusing on the question of death of cynicism and satire, which is related to the concept of free speech and expression. Now, I generally have a consideration that free speech is something which does not need to be seen with a much top-down approach, because most of the time, sometimes it does work, sometimes it does not work. And from a policy perspective, it must be seen very carefully. Every time we can't have a restrictive approach, and but with a libertarian thing, we need to see how much, because again, there's an aesthetic element to that. So, if you can explain about that part, then maybe I can come up with some follow-ups, and then maybe I'll take a few questions.
I mean, so I guess in reference to sort of the death of satire aspect and the cynicism, you know, the idea of satire is a way of portraying, especially the powerful, in a negative light, and to criticize them according to the way that they don't live up to the ideals they propose. Generally, that's the sort of model. But what happens when elites don't even speak of ideals anymore? And this is something that happened over the course of the end of history, when there weren't any big historical ideals anymore, and things were justified merely in terms of being competent managers, right? Elites, politicians would say, no, we're just going to be competent managers. Maybe I'm a businessman, or I have a business background, and therefore I know how to make things a little bit more efficient or whatever. But there were no real grand ideals of social emancipation, or of liberalism, or even of modernity or development, or even nationalism, really, more kind of conservative guys. Those things were kind of all off the table. So when you don't have elites promising anything anymore, making any big promises, it's hard to go, hey, you're not living up to your promises. As a consequence, people kind of become a bit cynical, because no one's really promising anything grand anymore, and they're not delivering on anything either. And politics becomes reduced to just this very narrow nitpicking between one guy saying, "Hey, I would manage things better," and the other one saying, "No, I would manage things better," which is not politics properly, right? They're not presenting alternative visions of how to run society. What you have at the end of history, especially, is the kind of the forms that political elites would hold to, which is presenting themselves as professional and competent, starts to fall apart, because what happens is that there's an increasing void between the state and people, between citizens and politicians, and politicians come to be seen as sort of a class apart, right? Just these completely strange people which we don't trust anymore, right? So and don't trust for good reason, but nevertheless, trust is an important thing in politics. And with that huge kind of trust deficit, you have politicians trying to seek new techniques of presenting themselves as popular. They don't actually do anything which might improve people's lives, because of course they're not going to do that. But they do present ways of seeming more authentic. And one of the ways they do that is by trying to be kind of ordinary, and maybe kind of be a bit corrupt and be a bit sleazy or whatever, because that's like ordinary people. Hey, I cheat my taxes too, so why don't you, so this guy who cheats his taxes, Donald Trump or whatever, he's just like me. So there's a way of kind of, basically a means of personalizing politics, rather than making politicians trying to speak in the public interest, talking about visions of the future. They're just present an image of themselves in lieu of presenting a vision of politics. What does this have to do with satire and cynicism? Well, when you have politicians just presenting themselves as kind of this image of themselves, it becomes quite hard to satirize. And it becomes even harder to satirize when the politician's own image already contains the satirical representation of themselves. So what does that mean? When Donald Trump is already a kind of buffoon, and he accepts that he's kind of a buffoon, and it becomes very hard to satirize. You can't say, hey, you're a disgusting, specimen. Look at you, you're ridiculous, because he already kind of is ridiculous, and he knows he's ridiculous. Where is the kind of key model of that person? It's Silvio Berlusconi in Italy in the early 90s, and throughout the 90s and 2000s, who is the kind of archetype of that. And that leads us to a world in which we as citizens, the ones who don't hold political power, increasingly cynical about any sort of claims of great ideals, and we're cynical about politicians and we're also unable to really find a critical angle on politicians because they already incorporate the satirical kind of representation of themselves. So anyway, it makes a difficult situation. I just want to make a comment on free speech, which you'd made. I think it's very important. Free speech. I'm an absolutist on the question. I think it's important, not just because of your right to speak, but more importantly because people have a right to hear. And I don't think there should be no power in society, no authority in society to decide other people can't hear, because people have to make their own minds up about things. And so whenever there's any form of censorship, it's ultimately saying that, hey, you're not allowed to listen. And I think we should be allowed to listen.
Of course. I mean, that's the essence of free speech at the end of the day. I think it happens in every society. And I can remember examples from all societies, I mean, Asian, African, and so forth. So we're getting to the last part of it. So I will be discussing postmodernism in general. And this will be related to, since we have been discussing Americanization and how cultures have been, people have been becoming like, okay, fine, they don't want the same thing. You very rightly pointed out one thing about the cynicism issue. And you said that, okay, fine. Now politics is becoming so monotonous that you just don't have that sense of participatory indulgence anymore, right? People are just thinking, okay, fine. He's just saying, let's get it done kind of thing. Let's get it done. So we are thinking, okay, we will make it happen. But in the long run, it seems so boring that, okay, fine, let it go, let it go, let it go. It's that kind of trend which is happening. In fact, I would say that it's happening in many countries around the world. So since that is there, one thing which happens with postmodernism is that it also is involved in killing cynicism and actually affects societies and governments in many ways. So in the case of a Brazilianization, how do we see the influence of postmodernism? Now, my understanding is that with postmodernism, there's also a field of study known as decoloniality. But with decoloniality, which is decolonization effectively, from digital colonialism or anything like that, scholars very much differ. Like Latin Americans think in their own way. Asians, within Asians, Indians and Chinese have their own considerations, or Indians and others, ASEAN people have their own considerations. So in that sense, how do you see the effect of postmodernism? Because as far as I know, postmodernism is also kind of an ideological worldview which is created in any field. I mean, in any even in normal areas, not just any academic thing, but even in normal areas. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's sort of an unwieldy topic, right? Postmodernism, and it's been described as the cultural logic of late capitalism, right? And I think there is something about postmodernism and postmodern ideas which apply very much to a society in which flexibility and fluidity is key. So the kind of old, more fixed, or if not fixed, but at least kind of more rigid forms of societies, of communities, of organizations, of ideas, no longer hold, right? And so as it relates to Brazilianization, you have this idea that Brazil was already kind of postmodern avant la lettre, right? So you kind of have this idea of, because of Brazil's course of development, you have this flexibility because things are never really decisively ever really resolved, and this need to become adaptable. And I describe this in more depth in the essay. I don't think I should go into the full thing here, but the basic idea is that it's almost a kind of cultural trope. The Brazilians are very adaptable, very tolerant, very easy to get along with, and so on, because they've had to learn with the fact that things don't always happen as they were promised. There's some big promised plan, it doesn't really get delivered, or bureaucracies don't work as they're meant to. It takes forever, and it's corrupt and whatever. So you just have to kind of learn to get by, right? And in that and that relates, I think, in some ways also to what we were talking about already about flexibilization in terms of labor, right? Precaritization, that you have to be kind of nimble on your feet, because you're no longer going to have a steady job for life. You're going to have to change jobs or hold several jobs at once, and keep repolishing your CV to apply to different things at once, and make yourself attractive to employers and so on. And so that increasingly flexibilized society, I guess, has its reflection in the world of ideas. One thing, though, that I would say is that what is often described now as postmodern ideas, and especially if you think about identity politics, probably as the most key example, is that you've had a real change, and you have and the sort of ideas of post-structuralist thinkers were all often about kind of, to put it in simple terms, fluidity, right? Fluidity and flexibility. Whereas now, when we talk about kind of postmodern identity politics, it seems to me that it's very much the opposite. It's very much about rigidity and about essences, about essentialism. So rather than being this kind of free play of identities where today I can be one thing and tomorrow I can be another thing, and you can just make up identities or change subcultures or whatever. Now it increasingly becoming increasingly rigid, and people no longer being an individual, but each individual is merely a reflection of their group belonging. So I'm no longer Alex Hochuli, I'm an avatar of whiteness or whatever, right? Which is often the kind of critique made by kind of decolonized scholars and whatever, or that maybe you as an Indian, you are necessarily Hindu or whatever it might be, and that is your essence, and that you need to be true to that, rather than a more modernist idea where no, you can transform things, and we can have a more universalist vision where we can all become modern secular people and not necessarily beholden to our past or what our essences might be. And that seems to be a change which I don't think is very good. I think it's actually very damaging. I would defend universalism and secularism, which are ideals which are unfortunately kind of on the back foot today. How does that relate to Brazilianization? I think that's one case where Brazil doesn't apply, and I think that's a good thing, where Brazil hasn't become so kind of essentialized in the way that you maybe are seeing in other places. So that's a good thing, maybe.
Well, I really like the reference of universalization and secularization you mentioned. In fact, that's the thing, because what generally is happening is that, of course, like since you mentioned India, now this is not about the political conundrum itself. So essentially, what is secularization? It means uniforming, making everything uniform, and that at a general level doesn't work out. Why? Because then you lose your roots, and again it delinks the relationship between tradition and modernity. So a relationship between tradition and modernity is obviously needed. Modernity is inevitable, but I think the influence that we have given about modernity without development, and the developments which we have been seeing so now, at least teaches us one thing, that if we have to go with modernity, we need to understand what our vulnerabilities are. Of course, I appreciate your suggestion of the revolution thing which you gave in the beginning. And of course, with respect to the views which have been shared, I really respect them and appreciate them. And the reason to invite you was basically the inquisitive nature of the article itself. So I would be more than happy to have a discussion with you in future, maybe on your upcoming book, and maybe we can discuss about it at some time. So thank you so much, Alex, for coming. And I also thank the viewers who have been watching us patiently. So please subscribe and like and share this video, and follow Internationalism Global Podcast on YouTube. We are also on LinkedIn. We are also on Twitter. We are also on Insta. So please do follow us. Until then, we'll come up with the next episode of Global Hint next week with Velina Shkarova from Austria. So you'd love that episode on Russia and the Indo-Pacific. Do wait for that. Until then, Alex, thank you so much. Thank you so much, viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.